All right, so welcome to the recorded lecture all about audit sampling. So in audit sampling, um, basically there are numerous transactions that the auditor needs to audit, but it's quite impossible to have all to be tested or to be reviewed. So that is why the auditor can opt to select samples over those items that he wants to audit. For example, in sales, there will be numerous sales invoices that he or she has to review. So using the sampling technique, he or she will be able to get a representative of those invoices. So in this case, audit sampling basically is less than 100% of the items within the population. So we'll talk about some details later. And using those samples, the auditor can draw his or her conclusion with regards to um, the items. In our example, that will be sales invoice. So does the sales head performed based on the procedures, or there are some deviations? So based on the samples, there will be some conclusions that the auditor can uh, conclude or can generate. So when you talk about population, that will be the entire set of data in which you want to select the sample. So in my example a while ago, that will be sales invoices. And then out of that population, you can select samples. So hoping that the samples will be representative of the population. So when you use sampling technique, it can have certain risk. So later we'll discuss about certain risk. Now, we cannot really expect that all the items may be conforming with the procedures set by the company, but there are items that will be we call exceptional. Okay, so we call it anomaly. Anomaly is where a certain deviation is not a representative of the population. So, as I mentioned a while ago, exception, it may be like a one-off event where it doesn't really provide a good picture about the population. Now, sampling risk is the risk that the auditor's conclusion based on the sample may differ from the conclusion if the entire population were subjected to same audit procedure. So, if if an auditor selected to or tested all items in the population in our example sales invoices, he or she will have a conclusion with regards to that. And that let us say assuming that he audited all the items, okay, there will be a particular uh, conclusion over that. But when the auditor selected samples, so out of the samples, they concluded something. They will say the sales invoices are properly recorded and documented. Okay, so that is their conclusion. It should be the same with the conclusion as if the auditor will audit all the items which included in the population. Now, non-sampling technique or non-sampling risk is where the auditor um, facing risk of audit uh, issues, but it's not really directly related to sampling technique. So in this case, maybe the auditor had selected the wrong procedure to test the item. So if we want to test let's say the occurrence of invoice, the best way to test the occurrence of invoice, or sorry, the occurrence of sales is through testing the invoices, seeing whether it's actually done, executed, and it actually happened. But if the auditor selected to test only the amount recorded in the invoice, it doesn't really uh, will be having a chance to test the occurrence. We are only testing valuation there. So non-sampling risk is the risk that the auditor may not be able to use the right or the appropriate audit procedure, which is not related to sampling technique. So what are the samples of sampling risk? There will be sampling risk uh, related to what type of audit strategy that we selected. So, for example, in the case of test controls, the controls are more effective than they actually are. So, in this case, what we will do is we will reduce our task or our work on substantive procedure and will focus on testing the controls. And that problem may arise. For example, in in the actual operation, the controls are not really working properly, but you opted to test more of the controls rather than performing substantive procedures. So you're selecting more samples in controls rather than the assertions. So that's one particular issue. The other one is when, let us say, you concluded that the substantive procedure approach will be more effective than focusing on test of controls. So in that case, you are exerting too much effort on substantive tests rather than focusing on the test of controls. Okay, so the auditor shall investigate the nature and cause of any deviations or misstatements identified, okay, and evaluate their possible effect on the purpose of the audit procedure and other areas of the audit. So we have two types of misstatements or let us say deviations here. So the first one is tolerable misstatements, that is on the assertion side, which reflecting on the financial statements. So, and then the other one is tolerable rate of deviation, okay, that will be focusing on internal control. So what you will do is you can set the level of uh, tolerance that you will accept or you will have on the audit deviations, okay, or let us say on the deviations from the audit. So in this case, there will be a monetary amount, okay, then you will try to set that amount. So anything above on that set amount, that will be above or intolerable, okay? So meaning you have to do certain steps to audit that particular item. So in rate of deviation, let us say you set 0.1% deviation as your tolerable rate. So any deviations above 0.1%, then it will uh, be a good reason for you to audit that particular control. So we have types of audit sampling. We have statistical and non-statistical sampling. So in this statistical sampling, you're using random selection and you can also use probability theory. In non-statistical sampling, it's generally like a judgmental approach, okay, and advisable to use for low risk account. So when you will select or perform audit sampling, okay, so what are the requirements that you need to have? Okay, so the first one is when you are designing an audit sample, you as an auditor shall consider the purpose of the audit procedure and the characteristics of the population from which the sample will be drawn. So audit sampling will still be based on what is the purpose of your audit. So again, coming back to my example, if we're trying to audit sales and we are trying to determine the occurrence of the sale, okay? So based on that, we'll get the invoices. Okay, out of the invoices, you'll try you will now try to set your sample size, okay, based on that, or based on the population. Now, going back to audit risk uh, result or the risk of material misstatement assessment. So when you had a high risk of material misstatement on certain accounts, basically what you will do is you will increase your effort on testing assertion. So in this case, let us say the risk of material misstatement is high based on your conclusion in the audit risk assessment, okay, for sales occurrence. So you will now base your sample on the risk. So the higher the risk, the more samples that you might require. So that is for the next step. You have to determine the sample size sufficiency. Okay, so that will you will try to reduce the sampling risk to acceptably low level. And then the auditor shall select items for the sample in such a way that each sampling unit in the population has a chance of selection. We don't want to be biased on selecting samples. So as much as possible, we'll try our best to give equal opportunity for all uh, items within the population. But then again, you cannot really have an absolute chance to select all because you're using sampling. So it is really recommended and advisable for the auditor to focus on the purpose, use the audit risk assessment as your basis in selecting samples. Now, when you're designing sample design or performing sample design, size, and selection of items for testing, you have to keep in mind that the purpose of the audit procedures, characteristics of the population, which is the source of the sample, okay, shall be considered. Sample size sufficiency to minimize sampling risk to acceptably low level shall be determined by the auditor, and sample selection shall be done in a way that each samples has the chance of uh, being selected. Now, when we are performing the audit, okay, this is related to the samples. The auditor shall perform audit procedures appropriate to the purpose of each item selected. So again, as I mentioned, when you're trying to test occurrence, you want to see whether the sales really happened. So you can get the invoices. You can also check the delivery receipt, okay, to cross-check. And then you can also do subsequent testing on collection of uh, receivables or outstanding balance of the customer. So if the audit procedure is not applicable to the selected item, the auditor shall perform the procedure on a replacement item. So if you cannot test the occurrence using those uh, audit procedures that you selected, for example, you want to inspect the documents, a review, or get the documentary evidences, a review the process. If those procedures may not be applicable to the item that you selected, you try to perform on a replacement item. If the auditor is unable to apply the design audit procedure or suitable alternative procedures to a selected item, the auditor shall treat the item as a deviation from the prescribed control in the case of test of controls or misstatements in the case of test of details. Now, this is what I'm talking about with regards to anomaly. Nature and cause of deviations and misstatements. Okay, so as an auditor, we'll try to investigate those deviations or misstatements that we identified from the samples. And then we'll try to see whether it affects the purpose of the audit and other particular items in the overall audit work. Okay, obtain a high degree of certainty that misstatements classified as anomaly is not representative of the population. So if it is an exception, you try your best to determine if it is really an anomaly. Okay, you have to do much effort to ensure that it's only an exception or anomaly. And then the third one is uh, for you to obtain this high degree of certainty, you have to perform additional procedures, as I mentioned a while ago. And then obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence that the misstatement or deviation does not affect the remainder of the population. So we'll separate that one. We'll perform a different approach on auditing that, and we'll see whether it's not really a representative of the population. Because you will conclude based on the samples that you obtain from the population. So you cannot use this anomaly, which is really quite rare, to be one of the items that you will use to conclude on the population. Okay, in projecting misstatements, the auditor shall project misstatements found in the sample of the population in the case of test of details. Okay, so that's my recorded lecture. Thank you for watching the recorded lecture.